their swords, and every other terrible implement of the soldier are the birthright of an American. Tench Coxe, a founding father who is almost totally forgotten and ignored today, was not only one of the leading advocates of the natural and individual right to keep and bear arms at the founding, but he actually had far more influence on the ratification debates over the Constitution than the Federalist Papers ever did, despite the fact that they're way more famous and known today. Now, he wrote a number of short series of essays in support of the Constitution throughout late 1787 and into 1788. They were widely read. They had significant impact in a number of states, not just New York, but Virginia and elsewhere. And today I'm covering an overview of his essays written under the name or the pen name A Pennsylvanian, which focused heavily on a line in the sand between delegated and reserved powers. He gave all kinds of explanations about that, but also individual rights like religious liberty, and of course, the right to keep and bear arms, self-defense. I'll get to all that in just a moment, but first, welcome and thank you for joining me here on the path to liberty. My name is Michael Bolden with the 10th Amendment Center, and this is the show for Wednesday, July 17th, 2024. Now, just to kick this off, it's important, whether it's the Federalists or the essays of Tench Coxe or the Anti-Federalist Papers, to answer the question, why the heck do we even read this stuff? Why is it important? And here from an article by Mike Meharry, he said, reading an 18th century legal document with a 21st century understanding of the words can quickly lead you way off the reservation. After all, the meanings of words can and do change over time. And James Madison, the so-called father of the Constitution, specifically warned what would happen if we took this approach. And this was still in the early 19th century. He was concerned what might happen if you used modern definitions rather than definitions of words understood by the people who gave the Constitution legal force. He said, if the meaning of the text be sought in the changeable meaning of the words composing it, it is evident that the shape and attributes of the government must partake of the changes to which the words and phrases of all living languages are constantly subject. What a metamorphosis would be produced in the code of law if all its ancient phraseology were to be taken in its modern sense. Now, this is basically taking what Madison warned against. This metamorphosis is really the tool of the living, breathing Constitution. What was passed some years ago, now we're going to redefine what that means today to fit whatever our political goal is. And they do this all the time. Madison warned against it, and Thomas Jefferson explained how we're supposed to understand the original legal meaning of the Constitution. So did many others. Here in a letter to William Johnson, he said, on every question of construction, carry ourselves back to the time when the Constitution was adopted. Recollect the spirit manifested in the debates, and instead of trying what meaning may be squeezed out of the text, which is what they do all the time, which is what I was just describing, he said, or invented against it, conform to the probable one in which it was passed. And James Madison, in that same letter to Henry Lee in 1824, he put it like this. He said, I entirely concur in the propriety of resorting to the sense in which the Constitution was accepted and ratified by the nation. In that sense alone, it is the legitimate Constitution. So in other words, in order to understand the original legal meaning of the Constitution, we have to research and understand how the people who gave it legal force, those are the people in the ratification debates, understood it. And if we want to understand how they understood things, well, we have to read what they had to say, what they wrote, what the speeches, the debates. We have to understand both sides. Even if you were just reading the Federalist, which is, we also have to think about what the Federalist Papers were. They were for a New York audience. They're all written to the citizens of New York, whether it was Jay, Hamilton, or Madison. They were reaching out to the people of New York because they were concerned that ratification was going to lose there. That's not to say that it's not amazing prose, but there's many of them, whether it's Federalist 25 or some of the others, where they're actually specifically responding to anti-Federalist arguments. And if you don't understand what the anti-Federalists were saying, then you can't really truly understand the context of what the Federalist Papers were saying. But if you can't read all the other stuff, I could go down a rabbit hole on this. Now, again, the Federalist Papers were written primarily for a New York audience, and they certainly influenced the ratification debates there, but they weren't widely read elsewhere, unlike people like Tench Coxe. And here from Rob Nadelson, he said, during the ratification era, that's 1787 through 90, he was among the most widely read pro-Constitution writers. He was famous at the time. Like the Federalist Papers, Coxe's writings helped mold public understanding of the Constitution's meaning. Unlike the Federalist, however, Coxe's essays were written in direct, easy-to-read language. Newspapers around the country printed and reprinted them, so people read them all over the place. And in February of 1788, from an article by Mike Meharry, How Tench Coxe Shaped the Ratification Debates, Essays of a Pennsylvanian, which I'm highlighting primarily for this episode, Mike writes, in February of 1788, the Pennsylvania Gazette, which was a very, very popular and widely read paper at the time, highly respected, published 4 essays under the pseudonym A Pennsylvanian. He wrote a 5th under that name in June, addressed solely to the New York Convention. Previously, he wrote a number of other essays under a bunch of other names, like An American Citizen, A Freeman, and there were a few others as well. Now, he said while his essays of a Pennsylvanian were obviously too late to impact the outcome of the Pennsylvania ratifying convention because they were published in February of 1788, and Pennsylvania ratified the Constitution in December of 1787, so he clearly was not writing this for Pennsylvania. They were widely read in the states that had yet to ratify. And here from Nadelson, he said, one vehicle why it was widely read was the Gazette itself. He chose this publication because he knew a lot of people were going to read it. Perhaps the most respected newspaper in America at the time and widely read outside of Pennsylvania. In addition, the Constitution's advocates distributed copies of the articles in other states. For example, Tench Coxe had a long back and forth with James Madison during the ratification debates. He was sending him copies of things, and Madison then had them distributed throughout Virginia. That's just another example. In anticipation of a national circulation, Tench also addressed his Pennsylvanian articles specifically to the people of the United States. So he was clearly writing for a very broad audience, unlike the Federalist Papers. Now, Professor Jacob E. Cook is a prominent biographer of Coxe, maybe the top one out there. He described these essays as, quote, Coxe's most noteworthy contribution to the ratification debates, and he added that they invite comparison to the best of the literature spawned by that controversy, including the Federalist Papers. I'll link to this book, Tench Coxe and the Early Republic, in the show notes. And hear from John Dinan talking about what Coxe was discussing. He was specifically responding to the anti-Federalist arguments in Pennsylvania, and they were important for this. He said, Pennsylvania became the second state to ratify the Constitution when delegates at a state ratifying convention voted to approve the Constitution by a 46-23 margin on December 12, 1787. Now, as a quick aside, there was some cancel culture going on in Pennsylvania. The Federalist side, and I'm not sure if Coxe was involved in this or not, but the Federalist side was really working to shut down anyone who was trying to print opposition. They really wanted to ram through the ratification in Pennsylvania. They made a grave error. They aroused a lot of alarm around the other states because they were like, look what's happening in Pennsylvania. Why are they rushing this so much? There must be a problem. We should slow down. And so they had to kind of change their approach because of this. But they got it through pretty quickly. The head count before ratification, I think, was 46-23, and it came out exactly after. This was partisan politics. Coxe even thought some of the opposition was partisan. I would think some of the people in favor were partisan as well. However, John writes, delegates who voted against the Constitution set out their various objections in writing after the fact. So once the ratification debate was happening, the Federalist side really pressured newspapers. I think there was even some violence at some of them, shutting them down to make sure that they couldn't print opposition. They didn't want to get the word out. But once that was all done, the printing, the dissent of the Pennsylvania Convention, it's called the Address and Reasons of Dissent of the Minority of the Convention of the State of Pennsylvania to their constituents. This was passed out all over the place. And maybe it wasn't printed widely in Pennsylvania because it wouldn't have had any impact at that time, but it was sent to various other states and had a lot of impact. So they put their objections in writing, and they were reprinted in newspapers in Pennsylvania and many other states, and were viewed as expressing the anti-Federalist chief concerns about the proposed Constitution. Like many other anti-Federalist writings, the people in Pennsylvania who opposed ratification were really focused heavily on the idea of consolidation or centralization of power. They thought that the proposed general government would eventually end up swallowing the powers of the states and destroying the liberty of the people. And we can certainly talk about predictions being right on some areas, but that's for a different discussion. But that was their argument. They claimed that federal power would either authorize this or would be abused to authorize it in the future. And Tench Coxe actually came down pretty hard, saying, like, look, this is not how things are supposed to be. And it was this dissent that Coxe was primarily responding to in his essays of a Pennsylvanian. He primarily attacked the worries about consolidation. First of all, he summarized the anti-federalist opposition, so he made it clear that he knew what they were saying. He said, the proposed Constitution will annihilate the legislative, executive, and judicial powers of the several states. And that was the great ground on which all the fears of the opposition rest in Pennsylvania and throughout the Union. Now, however, Meharry points out, Tench argued that this fear was unfounded because so many government functions were left outside the federal sphere. The legislature of each state, he wrote, must possess exclusively of Congress many powers which the latter can never exercise. James Madison had a similar approach in Federalist number 45, pointing out that the powers delegated by the proposed Constitution to the federal government were few and defined, and those reserved to the several states were numerous and indefinite. And he made that point that the legislature, just like James Madison, of each state would have all kinds of power which Congress was never authorized to exercise. That was in his third essay of a Pennsylvanian. Now, he went on to summarize that many of the powers that remained with the states were never going to be authorized to the federal government. He actually went through a whole list of various things, and he had various categories. The first one we can talk about is really infrastructure. All these so-called infrastructure spending bills today, well, maybe they could handle interstate highways. Those are the post roads of the founding generation. But for Tench Coxe and many of the Federalists, they said, no way, you're not authorized to do this. James Madison, on his last day in office as president, despite the fact that he actually supported an infrastructure spending bill, he actually vetoed it because he said this is not a power delegated to the federal government under the Constitution. So he's willing in his last day of office to say, no, you can't even do something that I want you to do. Anyways, for instance, Mike writes, Tench Coxe said that states would retain most powers relating to infrastructure, including, quote, the improvement of the country by general roads, canals, bridges, clearing rivers, erecting ferries, building state houses, town halls, courthouses, market houses, county goals, jails, etc., poorhouses, places of worship, state and county schools and hospitals. Anything that the people wanted to get done would be done by the people of each state. Now, that didn't mean that the state government would do this. It would be each state to determine, the people of each state to determine if they wanted the market to do it or something else. That's the whole division of federalism. So infrastructure, all kinds of infrastructure spending that happens today, the Federalist side, and Tench Coxe was very forceful and clear about this, was never authorized to the federal government. He also talked about police powers. These are the broad powers that Madison talked about in Fed 45, reserved to the states. He said states would retain police powers, including authority to, quote, and this is from Coxe as well, prescribe the various punishments that shall be inflicted for disorders, riots, assaults, larcenies, bigamy, arson, burglaries, murders, state treason, and many other offenses against their peace and dignity, which being in no way subjected to the jurisdiction of the federal legislature would go unpunished. So he's saying all kinds of criminal law, basically all of it, is out of the hands of the federal government. There are no there's only a few small categories of where the federal government is even authorized to engage in criminal law enforcement. So all those agencies that we hear about, most of them shouldn't even exist because they're not needed. This is supposed to be handled on a state or a local level as the people of each state determine. Now, and of course, Mike writes, the federal government was going to have no power over the internal administration of the state. Again, this included civil and criminal matters, elections, and more. He writes, they can create, and this is from Tench again, they can create new state offices and abolish old ones, regulate descents of lands and the distribution of other property of persons dying interstate, providing for calling out the militia for any purposes within the state, prescribe the qualifications of electors of the state, and even of the federal representatives, make donations of lands, erect new state courts, incorporate societies for the purpose of religion, learning, policy, or profit, erect counties, cities, towns, and boroughs. The federal government can't create those things. They can't create states. They can't create counties or cities or towns. They have no say over any of this stuff. They can divide an extensive territory into two governments. This is the state governments. Declare what offenses shall be impeachable in the states, and the pains and penalties that shall be consequent on conviction, and elect the federal senators. So they were not fans of probably what became the 17th Amendment, but that's a whole nother discussion. Even James Madison at one point certainly warned that if they ever chose the Senate in the same way as the House, you'd have an entire consolidated government, and that would be very, very bad for liberty. And, well, we have that today. So the internal power of the states over so many things. And he summed it up by saying these would all be independent of the control or interference of the federal government. Well, at least that's how it's supposed to be. And Coxe went on to sum up the differences between federal and state governments. He argued that they are entirely different entities with different purposes, different structures, etc. He said the federal government and the state governments are neither coordinate, co-equal, nor even similar. They are of different natures. They're a totally different structure. And in fact, the way that powers are delegated and reserved are totally opposite between the federal government and the state governments. And Mike says he went on to contrast the two types of governments. He said the general government is a federal or a union of sovereignties for special purposes. The state governments are social or an association of individuals for all the purposes of society and government. So state governments would have, if they were to pass stuff, now that doesn't mean state governments are awesome. They certainly are terrible, at least in modern times, but they operate directly on individuals. The federal government does, they have a different approach. I mean, certainly they operate on individuals, but in a very, very, very limited sphere in comparison to what the state governments could do. And here, this is from page 496 of the documentary history volume that contains these, that was just released in the last couple of years. He said, without the state governments, that of the Union can have no power, since the latter is created by them. But the state governments have and ever must have much separate and independent power, and do not derive from the federal government any part of what they possess. They are independent, sovereign states. That's what it said in the Treaty of Paris. That's certainly what it said in the Declaration of Independence. That's what they formed as a union under the Articles of Confederation. And they formed the same type of a union, albeit a stronger central government, the same structure, the same foundational principle, that these are independent sovereign bodies joining as a union for specifically delegated purposes. And, well, they're completely different according to Tench Coxe here. Now, I'm going to hit on his views on the power of the sword, the natural right of self-defense, the right to keep and bear arms, and religious liberty in just a moment. But first, I should mention that about 2 hours after the live stream is done here, we get a blog post published for this episode, just like we do for every single episode, over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path-to-liberty. It's all spelled out. 10thamendmentcenter.com/path-to-liberty. Alan Mosley organizes the blog posts, and for each one, you're going to find not only all the different platforms we're on. Of course, we live stream on the mainstream ones like X and YouTube and Facebook and Twitch and LinkedIn, but we also live stream over at rumble.com and odyssey.com. We've got a really strong, growing community on some of these other platforms. Hello to Brewster and Gypsy and a few others over on Rumble. I appreciate you being here. Again, that'll be over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path-to-liberty. So you can find all the different platforms around the video platforms, audio-only podcast edition, plus a section with show links. So all the stuff that I mentioned here, these articles, the original source documents from Tench Coxe and others, the letters from Jefferson and Madison describing how to understand the original legal meaning of the Constitution, that'll all be linked to in the show notes so you can read and learn more in context on your own time. And while I'm here, I want to take a quick moment and say hello to everyone out in the live chat. I appreciate you being here. Whether this is your first episode or you've been here for every single one since day one, I'm so grateful for you spending some of your time with me today. There's Dixie and Kirk. Chris, Rights Are Not Tradition. Haji, good to see you. Diana, Cheriton Farmer, there's Brewster again, Howard Clegg, Cloder, Diana, Zephael, and a few others. I know I'm pronouncing things wrong. Again, thank you so much for being here. We're going to get a blog post with the show notes published in a couple of hours over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. Now, we definitely want to get into the power of the sword because Tench Coxe, for people who do know of him, generally they only know of his writing on the right to keep and bear arms, the natural right of self-defense, the first law of self-preservation. Mike Meharry writes that Coxe also addressed worries that the power of the sword was solely in the hands of Congress. The dissent in Pennsylvania, they were very concerned that there would be too much power over the sword in the central government, and therefore that would destroy liberty. But Tench countered that the sword was truly in the hands of the people. He said, the yeomanry of America from 16 to 60. And of course, he's referencing the militia, the unorganized militia. He believed it was an essential first line of defense. He said the militia of these free commonwealths. Again, these are free, independent commonwealths deciding to join a union for very limited, delegated, specific purposes that will help keep the peace and advance prosperity, or at least that was the goal. He said the militia of these free commonwealths, entitled and accustomed to their arms, when compared with any possible army, must be tremendous and irresistible. And of course, who makes up the militia? For Coxe, it's the yeomanry from 16 through 60. It's the people themselves. And so he was not concerned about the people oppressing themselves, although I guess we see much of that today. But here he is. He wrote that Congress have no power to disarm the militia. And this does not mean a militia run by the central government. This is the people themselves. Congress has no power to disarm them whatsoever. He said their swords and every other terrible implement of the soldier are the birthright of an American. So Tench Coxe goes much further than most people today who support the natural, well, they support a permission-based gun rights, basically constitutional carry if it's basically remove any permission slip. But if it has any type of you got to get a permit, then this is really still asking government for permission on a state level. But he's talking about on a federal level specifically as well, that the people have the power, the birthright to carry the weapons of the military. Today, the federal government has been banning that kind of stuff for decades. We aren't able to, except with a very expensive tax, very long permit process. So as long as the government tells us, okay, well, you're authorized to have this machine gun, then of course you can. But for Tench Coxe, the terrible implements of a soldier are the birthright of an American. And that's how you have a strong national defense. Even Henry Knox pointed this out in the early 1790s in the Washington administration. That should be the capital security of a free state, not a standing army. Anyways, Coxe said, what clause in the state or federal constitutions hath given away that important right? None. He's pointing out that you have to look at both constitutions, this birthright of an American. So the people themselves are, well, he said, anyways, he goes on. He said, the unlimited power of the sword is not in the hands of either the federal or state governments, but where I trust in God, it will ever remain in the hands of the people. So when they tell you, oh, what are you going to do, have an F-15? You can't have an AR-15 against us because we have more power. But for Tench Coxe and many other leading founders, he was probably the most vocal about this. He was specifically pointing out that the top of the food chain when it comes to using the power of violence is the people themselves. They have to retain that power, of course, not only to defend against foreign dangers, but against domestic ones again. Now, Meharry points out that another category is religious liberty. But in this explanation where he's saying there's no power delegated in either the federal or state constitutions to take away this natural right of the people, he's arguing that the federal government would only possess the powers delegated to it. He's actually making a similar case about state governments. In his fourth essay, Coxe took the same approach by addressing the charge that the Constitution would endanger religious liberty. There was some concern that if you didn't carve out a protection for religious liberty, the federal government would violate that right. And of course, this was a big debate over whether or not to have a Bill of Rights. the Federalist side are saying, look, this is a system of delegated and reserved powers. If we now start saying that they can't do stuff that they already weren't authorized to do, that is going to create confusion over the entire structure of the system. And I think in many ways, the Federalist argument on this was correct. The anti-Federalist side, whether it was Federal Farmer, for example, who specifically said this is just a matter of opinion, or Patrick Henry, who said, like, okay, yeah, I agree with you, but this is new. Like, no other system is ever created like this. All the state constitutions were never like this. I'm sure, all over Pennsylvania, the same kind of argument. Just because you're telling us this, nothing has ever played out like that in the past. So maybe it was because it was such a new form that this confusion came up. I think the Federalists actually made a stronger case on this because they warned that as soon as you start saying, well, why would you even add this Bill of Rights if the whole thing is about delegated and reserved powers anyways? If they only have the powers delegated to them, of course, there's no power to intermeddle. There's no power delegated to them to take away the natural birthright of an American, their right to have the terrible implements of a soldier. There is no power over religious liberty. He said the most careful examination of the powers to be vested in Congress will not enable us to discover one clause by which the federal legislature can interfere in religious affairs. So given, Mike Meharry writes, that there are no delegated powers relating to religious liberty, that power would be left to the states, as each state determined. And as Tench Coxe said, the convention have carefully avoided investing them with any authority of that nature. So the Constitution, if it wasn't delegated to the federal government, they couldn't touch it. There was no point in adding another article that said, well, now we really mean it. You don't have any power over the right to keep and bear arms. And I think in many ways, it has played out the opposite. People have read it kind of, unless it's spelled out, the federal government can do whatever the hell they want. And that's kind of how it plays out today. Now, he gave a number of reasons why he felt, just personally, this is kind of a policy choice as to why the Philadelphia Convention did not include power over religious liberty. He said, the Constitution have carefully avoided investing them with any authority of that nature, in my opinion, from the purest and wisest reasons. There are three reasons. He said the most important was that most of the convention were averse to the interference of human authority in forming laws concerning matters of conscience, remembering that even the omnipotent creator of the universe has granted free will to man. So this is about individual self-sovereignty, self-ownership, ownership of our thoughts, our beliefs, our viewpoints, and therefore the government should have no power over this whatsoever. And he said this is the majority of the convention. I'm sure there were a handful in there who were of a different take, but that's a different discussion. He said conscience was given us for our guide by the wisdom and goodness of the deity, to whom alone we are responsible. Duly sensible of this, the convention have rejected as sacrilegious all human interposition. Mike Meharry puts it like this: with their wide circulation and persuasive arguments, it's undeniable that Tench Coxe's essays influenced ratification in other states. His assurances almost certainly moved some fence-sitters to vote for ratification. So Virginia was very close. They thought maybe it was going to lose. New York was very close. They thought it was going to lose. Massachusetts had just ratified. That was also very close. They thought it was going to lose. And there were some other essays that Tench wrote that may have had some impact there as well. But he said this is significant because it reveals the extent of the power people believed they were delegating to the new federal government under the Constitution. So this was the case that was made. Oh, we're very concerned about this. You've made a persuasive argument that they're not going to have the power authorized, and then it's just up to us to keep them in check. That's certainly what John Dickinson had to say in his Fabius letters. This was how supporters of the Constitution, Mike writes, sold the document, and it served as the basis for ratification, explaining how things are supposed to be. And Nadelson, talking about all these powers that Tench Coxe said were going to be reserved to the states, the infrastructure, the police powers, power over so many areas in elections, and all the other internal administration. He said this helped cement in the public mind the most natural meaning of the text. The Constitution created a strictly limited central government, which outside now the District of Columbia and the territories had no authority over most aspects of American life. Now, obviously, that is not what we live under today. It's not even close. We live under the largest government in history. But Rob writes that Coxe's work demonstrates clearly that the current bloated federal government was not what the American people agreed to when they ratified the Constitution. In other words, that many of the current federal activities are simply illegitimate. I would actually also say that Coxe's writing, because it was so clean and so clear and concise about the line in the sand between delegated and reserved powers, is also another example of, well, words on paper don't enforce themselves. They never did. They never will. As John Dickinson put it in his Fabius letters in April of 1788, he was on the same side. He was originally the lead author of the Articles of Confederation, but he became a strong supporter of ratification of the Constitution. And his argument was that a good Constitution promotes but doesn't always produce a good administration. So the fact that Tench Coxe, John Dickinson, James Madison, and so many others explain so clearly the powers that were going to be delegated to the federal government and the versus everything else reserved to the states, the people of the several states, the fact that it hasn't played out that way, I do not think is the fault of a document, because a constitution has never been able to enforce themselves. It is the fault of the people who have not understood the original legal meaning of the document, of what the powers delegated to the federal government are supposed to be. And then, of course, the failure of the people to keep it in check when it refuses to follow the rules, which for us is 24/7, 365. And that's why we feel it's so essential to teach these original foundational principles and get this information out to more and more people. And absolutely nothing helps us do this work more every single day, more than the financial faith and support of our members. If you got a couple of bucks of that dirty government fiat, which they keep devaluing every single day, throw it our way. We will use it to take a stand for the Constitution and liberty, whether they like it or not. They certainly do not. You can join us for as little as $2 a month over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. Again, 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. We also have annual, 5-year, and lifetime options. You can make a one-time donation over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/donate. And enough of the promotion. I really appreciate you spending some of your time with me here today. We're going to get the blog post published in a couple of hours so you can read all this stuff. I'm just scratching the surface. You can read and learn more in context on your own time. That's over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. I hope you enjoyed this episode. I hope it made you think. I hope you learned something. And I hope to see you next time here on the Path to Liberty.